Every January, the average American household spends more on groceries than in any other month of the year. Winter produce prices spike between 20 and 40% compared to summer. The lettuce ships in from central Mexico. The berries fly in from Chile. The tomatoes get picked green in Florida warehouses and gassed with ethylene until they look ripe enough to sell. And the entire system relies on diesel fuel, refrigerated trucking, and a supply chain so brittle that a single port disruption can empty store shelves in under 2 days. But here is what almost nobody talks about. For thousands of years before any of that infrastructure existed, people on this continent ate through winter. They did not starve waiting for spring. They did not depend on a single shipment from 1,000 miles away. They had plants, native plants that had evolved over millennia to produce food in cold months, to hold fruit on the branch long after the leaves were gone, to store dense calories underground beyond the reach of frost. These were not exotic rarities. They grew in every region of what is now the United States. They required no pesticides, no irrigation systems, no annual replanting. And many of them still grow wild right now in forgotten edges of this country, completely ignored. The reason isn't complicated. These plants were replaced, not because they stopped working, but because they could not be packaged, commodified, and sold at industrial scale the way annual monocrops could. The profit structure of modern agriculture had no place for a perennial that produced food for free, year after year, without anyone buying new seed. So an entire continent's worth of winter food knowledge, accumulated over centuries, disappeared in a few generations. These are 20 of those plants ranked by the scale of what we lost when we stopped paying attention. Number 20, bearberry. You have probably walked right past this plant without ever knowing it was food. Bearberry, also called kinnikinnick, is a tough, low-creeping evergreen that hugs the ground across northern forests and mountainsides from coast to coast. Its small red berries appear in late summer and persist straight through winter, clinging to the stems under snow and ice. The Cree, the Blackfoot, the Chippewa, and dozens of other nations ate these berries through the coldest months, often mixed with rendered fat and dried meat to make pemmican. They are not sweet. They are mealy and mild. But they hold their nutrition through months of freezing temperatures without rotting, which is exactly the trait that mattered when survival was the priority. You will never find bearberry in a grocery store because its flavor does not compete with a strawberry, and no one has figured out how to grow it at commercial scale. But the plant itself has never stopped producing. It is still out there, under the snow, doing exactly what it has done for 10,000 years. Number 19, staghorn sumac. If you live anywhere east of the Mississippi, you have driven past staghorn sumac 1,000 times without knowing you were looking at food. Those deep red, fuzzy clusters of berries that stand upright on the branches like torches are not decorative. They are edible, and they hang on the plant from late summer, well into winter. Indigenous communities across the eastern woodlands soak the berries in cold water to produce a tart, vitamin-rich drink that colonists eventually called Indian lemonade. The berries were also dried and ground into a tangy spice used on meat and fish. Staghorn sumac grows aggressively on roadsides, in abandoned fields, and along the edges of woods. It does not need good soil. It does not need watering. It colonizes disturbed land and produces food reliably without any human intervention. The reason it vanished from the American diet is simple. A plant that grows free on the roadside has no value in a system that requires transactions. Number 18, partridge berry. This one hides in plain sight. Partridge berry is a tiny trailing vine that carpets the forest floor across the entire eastern half of North America. Its bright red berries ripen in late fall and stay on the plant all winter long, even under a layer of snow. The Cherokee, the Iroquois, and the Algonquin all gathered these berries as winter food. They are mild in flavor but surprisingly sustaining, and they were often combined with other preserved foods during the lean months. The plant is evergreen, meaning even its leaves stay viable through the coldest weeks of the year. Partridgeberry requires almost nothing. It grows in shade, tolerates poor soil, and spreads quietly on its own. It was once so common in the eastern forest diet that early colonists noted it in their accounts of native food practices. Today, it is sold occasionally as an ornamental ground cover. Almost nobody who buys it realizes it produces food. Number 17. Eastern red cedar. This tree is not actually a cedar. It is a juniper, and it is one of the most widespread native trees in North America. Its small blue berry-like cones are available on the tree year-round, and they have been used as food and medicine by indigenous peoples for centuries. The Cheyenne, the Dakota, the Pawnee, and the Comanche all used eastern red cedar berries as a winter food source and a seasoning for preserved meats. The berries have a resinous, piney flavor that works in small quantities the way black pepper or rosemary does. The tree itself is nearly indestructible. It grows in drought, in poor soil, in extreme heat, and in bitter cold. Across millions of acres of American rangeland, it has been actively removed because the cattle industry views it as a nuisance that competes with grass. A native tree that feeds people for free was reclassified as a problem because it interfered with commercial livestock production. Number 16. Wintergreen. Most Americans know wintergreen as a flavor in gum and candy. Very few realize it is a real plant that grows wild across northeastern forests and produces both edible leaves and small red berries that persist through the entire winter. The leaves can be chewed raw or steeped into tea at any point during the cold months. The berries sweeten after frost and hold on the plant well into February. The Ojibwe and the Haudenosaunee used wintergreen as both a food and a medicine through the coldest part of the year. It is rich in methyl salicylate, a compound closely related to aspirin, meaning it served as a pain reliever and anti-inflammatory. At the same time, it was providing nutrition. The synthetic version of wintergreen flavor replaced the real plant in the early 20th century, and within a generation, most Americans forgot it existed at all. It still grows wild in acidic forest soils from Minnesota to Georgia. It asks for absolutely nothing and gives back food 12 months a year. Number 15. Oregon grape. On the western side of the continent, Oregon grape filled a role that almost nothing else could. This tough, evergreen shrub produces clusters of tart blue berries that look remarkably like small grapes and persist on the plant into the winter months. Native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, including the Coast Salish, the Yakima, and the Chinook, harvested Oregon grape berries as a regular part of their cold season diet. The berries are high in vitamin C and were often dried or mixed with other foods for long preservation. The plant thrives in shaded forest understory and is essentially maintenance-free once established. It is now commonly planted as an ornamental landscape shrub in cities across the West Coast. Homeowners pay nurseries for it, install it in their yards, and never once harvest the food it produces every year. That is the distance between what this plant was and what we have turned it into. Number 14. High bush cranberry. This is not a true cranberry, but the name stuck because the bright red berries look and function almost identically. High bush cranberry is a native viburnum that grows across the northern United States and into Canada, and its berries ripen in fall and hang on the shrub through the entire winter. They actually improve in flavor after repeated freezing and thawing. The Cree, the Ojibwe, and the Algonquin gathered these berries well into the cold months. They were eaten fresh, cooked into sauces, and stored with minimal processing. The plant tolerates extreme cold, wet soils, and partial shade. It is virtually disease-free. And yet it was completely replaced in the American diet by the commercial cranberry, which requires flooded bogs, heavy inputs, and an industrial harvesting process controlled by a small number of large corporations. The choice between these two plants was never about nutrition or taste. It was about which one could be owned. Number 13. Rose hips. Several species of wild rose are native to North America, and all of them produce rose hips, the small round fruit that remains on the plant after the petals fall. These hips persist through winter and contain dramatically more vitamin C per gram than oranges. During the Second World War, the British government organized a nationwide campaign to gather wild rose hips when citrus imports were cut off by naval blockades. But indigenous communities in North America had been using rose hips as a winter food source for centuries before that. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Blackfoot all harvested and dried rose hips for use through the cold months. In modern America, rose hips are virtually absent from the food supply. They appear occasionally in herbal teas and nothing more. The idea of walking outside in December and picking a fruit richer in vitamin C than anything on a grocery store shelf simply does not occur to most people. The plants have not stopped offering. We stopped taking. Number 12. Wild ginger. This plant is not related to the ginger you buy at the store. American wild ginger is a low-growing woodland species native to eastern North America, and its thick, aromatic rhizomes sit just below the soil surface year-round. Indigenous peoples, including the Meskwaki and the Cherokee, dug these roots in cold months and used them as both a spice and a medicinal food. The flavor is warm and pungent, close to commercial ginger but distinctly its own. The plant spreads slowly through shaded, rich forest soil, forming dense colonies over time that persist for decades. Once established, it requires nothing. No replanting, no watering, no fertilizer. It simply continues to expand and produce roots, quietly, without attention. Wild ginger vanished from common knowledge not because it became rare, but because the global spice trade made it unnecessary. When ginger could be shipped from Asia for pennies a pound, no one needed to walk into the woods anymore. Number 11. Sassafras. Every part of the sassafras tree has been used as food at some point in this continent's history. The roots brewed into tea, the dried leaves ground into filet powder, the thickening agent still essential to traditional Cajun gumbo, the young spring shoots eaten as a vegetable. Sassafras was one of the most widely used food plants among indigenous nations across the eastern half of the continent, and it was one of the earliest American exports to Europe. The Spanish and the French shipped sassafras root back to their home countries in enormous quantities during the 16th and 17th centuries. Then in 1960, the FDA restricted safrole, a compound found in sassafras root oil, citing laboratory studies on rats given extreme doses. That single regulatory decision effectively erased sassafras from the American food supply overnight. The tree itself did not change. It still grows abundantly from Texas to Maine. Its roots are still in the ground right now in the middle of winter, doing exactly what they have always done. What changed was not the plant. It was permission. Number 10. White pine. White pine needles contain significant amounts of vitamin C and vitamin A, and they are available on the tree year-round, including in the dead of winter when no other green thing is alive. The Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, and the Abenaki all made teas from pine needles during the cold months as both a nutritional staple and a remedy. During the age of exploration, scurvy killed more sailors and settlers than warfare, and multiple accounts describe indigenous peoples sharing their knowledge of evergreen needle teas with Europeans who were dying from vitamin deficiency in forests that held the cure on every branch. The inner bark of white pine is also edible. It can be dried and ground into a flour that served as a caloric supplement when other food ran short. In a country where a head of winter lettuce costs $4 and contains almost nothing of nutritional value, the fact that vitamin-rich food is hanging on trees in every northern forest and nobody reaches for it should raise questions. Not about the plant, about the system that trained us to walk past it. Number 9. Eastern prickly pear. Most people associate prickly pear cactus with the desert southwest, but a native species called Opuntia humifusa grows wild as far north as southern Ontario and as far east as the Atlantic coast. Its thick, flat pads are evergreen and edible year-round. They can be harvested in January. Indigenous peoples across a surprisingly wide range use prickly pear pads as a food source through every season, including winter. The pads are high in fiber and contain measurable amounts of calcium and magnesium. Modern studies have shown they may help regulate blood sugar. This is a plant that asks for almost nothing in return. It grows in sand, in gravel, in rock crevices, in places where nothing else survives. It produces food in conditions that would destroy any commercial vegetable within days. It has been growing in plain sight across the eastern United States for thousands of years, largely unrecognized as food by the people who now live around it. Number 8. Miner's lettuce. During the California gold rush of the 1840s and 1850s, prospectors flooding into the Sierra foothills faced a problem that had nothing to do with gold. They were developing scurvy. The native Miwok and Ohlone peoples showed them a small, round-leafed plant that grew in cool, shaded spots, often pushing up through damp soil in the middle of winter. It was fresh, tender, and edible raw. The miners ate it by the handful, and it kept them alive. They called it miner's lettuce. The plant is native to western North America and thrives specifically in cool, wet conditions. It germinates in fall, grows through winter, and produces edible leaves and stems during the exact months when commercial lettuce requires heated greenhouses and transcontinental shipping to reach your plate. It self-seeds. It comes back every year. It can be grown in a backyard container on a shaded porch. And yet, almost no one outside of foraging communities has ever heard of it. Fresh, free salad greens in February, and the seed industry never mentions it. Number 7. American cranberry. You know cranberry. You have eaten it at Thanksgiving your entire life, but the version you know has almost nothing in common with the original. Wild American cranberry grows in acidic bogs and wetlands across the northern United States. The berries ripen in fall and persist naturally through winter, held in cold water and acidic conditions that prevent decay. Indigenous peoples, including the Wampanoag and the Lenape, harvested cranberries well into the cold months and stored them with minimal processing because the fruit's own chemistry resists spoilage. The modern cranberry industry transformed this plant beyond recognition. Commercial cranberries are grown in heavily managed, artificially flooded bogs controlled by a handful of major corporations. They are processed into juice cocktails loaded with added sugar or pressed into canned jelly that bears no resemblance to the original fruit. The wild plant stores itself. It preserves itself. It needs no factory and no packaging line. But you cannot build a multi-billion-dollar industry around a fruit people can pick for free from a bog. So the industry built one around a version people could not. Number 6. American hazelnut. Before imported European hazelnuts and California almonds dominated the nut aisle, a native hazelnut grew wild across the eastern and central United States, producing food every year without anyone planting it. American hazelnut is a tough, suckering shrub that produces small, intensely flavored nuts, ripening in early fall and storing easily through the entire winter with no special treatment. The Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Cherokee all relied on American hazelnut as a significant winter calorie source. The nuts are dense with fat and protein, exactly what a body needs during cold months. The shrub grows in a wide range of soils and climates. It supports native pollinators. It requires no spraying, no commercial fertilizer, no irrigation. American hazelnut was passed over by the agricultural industry in favor of the European species because the European nut is slightly larger and more uniform in shape. It fit the packaging better. Flavor, resilience, and ecological function were never part of the calculation. Number 5. Wapato. If you have never heard of Wapato, you are not alone. But 200 years ago, this plant was one of the most important food sources on the continent. Wapato, also called duck potato, is an aquatic plant that grows in shallow ponds, marshes, and slow-moving streams across North America. Its starchy tubers form in the mud beneath the water and were traditionally harvested in late fall and winter, often by wading into cold water and loosening them with bare feet. The Chinook, the Walla Walla, and many other nations depended on Wapato as a winter staple. Lewis and Clark documented its importance extensively during their expedition. The tubers taste similar to potatoes when roasted and are comparable in caloric density. Wapato was not displaced by a better food. It was displaced by the destruction of its habitat. As wetlands across America were drained for agriculture and development throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the places where Wapato grew simply ceased to exist. The plant did not fail. We destroyed the land it needed, and then we forgot it had ever fed anyone. Number 4. Cattail. Some foragers call cattail the supermarket of the swamp, and they are not exaggerating. Nearly every part of this plant is edible in some form at some point during the year. But for winter food security, the rhizomes are what matter most. Cattail rhizomes sit in dense mats beneath the surface of marshes, ponds, and wet ditches, and they are available year-round, including through winter, in any water that is not frozen solid to the bottom. They are starchy and calorie-dense, and can be processed into a flour that was a staple food for indigenous communities across the entire continent. Cattail is native to every single state in the country. It grows in any standing water. It spreads aggressively without encouragement, and it can produce remarkable quantities of starch per acre, rivaling potatoes and corn when the rhizomes are harvested efficiently. That fact alone should tell you why it was never developed into a commercial crop. A plant that produces staple-level calories per acre, grows without anyone planting it, requires no purchased inputs, and cannot be patented is not an asset to the commercial food system. It is a direct threat to its business model. Number 3. Jerusalem artichoke. It is not from Jerusalem. It is not an artichoke. It is a native North American sunflower, and its knobby tubers may be the single most productive winter food source this continent has ever offered. Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke, was cultivated by indigenous nations from the Great Plains to the Atlantic seaboard long before European contact. The tubers remain in the ground through winter and actually improve in sweetness after frost, converting their stored inulin into fructose as temperatures drop. They can be dug from the soil at any point during the cold months, even from partially frozen ground. One planting produces food indefinitely. The plant returns every year, spreads on its own, and delivers enormous yields in soil so poor that nothing else will grow in it. Samuel de Champlain sent Jerusalem artichoke tubers back to France around 1605, and they became a common food across Europe for over a century. In North America, they were gradually pushed aside as the potato took over, backed by an agricultural system that preferred a crop requiring annual replanting and purchased seed each spring. The sunchoke needed neither of those things. That made it commercially irrelevant and ecologically invaluable. Number 2. Groundnut. This is the plant that could have redirected American agriculture entirely, and the fact that you have probably never heard of it tells you everything about how food systems actually get built. Groundnut, Apios americana, is a perennial climbing vine native to eastern North America. It produces chains of small, dense tubers underground that contain roughly 3 times the protein of a standard potato. They also carry significant calcium and iron. The plant is a legume, which means it fixes atmospheric nitrogen in the soil, actively improving the earth it grows in, rather than depleting it the way most crops do. The Haudenosaunee, the Wampanoag, the Lenape, and many other nations ate groundnut tubers as a routine winter food. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, groundnut helped keep them alive through their earliest winters. Multiple colonial accounts confirm this directly. In the 20th century, researchers at Louisiana State University launched a serious breeding program to develop groundnut into a modern crop. The results were extraordinary. The tubers were nutritious, the yields were promising. The plant improved soil fertility with every growing season, but funding dried up. No major seed company could profit from a perennial that never required replanting. No fertilizer manufacturer could sell inputs to a crop that made its own nitrogen. Groundnut was not shelved because it failed. It was shelved because it succeeded in ways the agricultural industry could not monetize. Number 1. American persimmon. There is a tree that grows wild from Connecticut to Kansas, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. It produces fruit so sweet that Captain John Smith, writing in 1612, compared it to the finest fruit he had ever tasted. It requires no spraying, no fertilizer, and no irrigation once established. A single tree can produce food for 75 years or more. And it does something that almost no other fruit tree in North America does. It delivers its sweetest, most flavorful fruit after the first hard frost of autumn, at the exact moment when virtually every other food plant on the continent has shut down for the year. The American persimmon was one of the most important food trees for indigenous peoples across the entire eastern half of this landmass. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Powhatan, and dozens of other nations ate persimmons fresh, dried them into dense, calorie-rich cakes, and stored them as a primary winter food that lasted for months. The fruit is rich in natural sugars, fiber, and vitamin C. A single mature tree in a good year can produce several hundred pounds of fruit, all of it arriving in November and December, when the grocery supply chain is at its most expensive and its most vulnerable. American persimmon was edged out of the commercial market by the Asian persimmon, a larger, more uniform fruit that could be picked firm and shipped across long distances without bruising. The native tree's fruit is smaller, softer, and impossible to stack neatly in a plastic clamshell container. It drops from the branch when it is ready. It cannot be rushed, scheduled, or made to conform to industrial timing. And so, a tree that fed this continent through thousands of winters was quietly pushed aside in favor of one that fit inside a box. That is the pattern running beneath every single entry on this list. 20 plants. 20 versions of the same story told 20 different ways. Not one of them disappeared because it stopped working. Every single one was displaced by a system that valued control, uniformity, and profit over resilience, nutrition, and access. The plants themselves are still here. The bearberry is still under the snow. The sumac is still standing along the highway. The cattail is still holding its ground in the frozen marsh. The persimmon is still dropping sweet fruit in December, waiting for someone to walk over and pick it up. Your grocery bill went up again this winter. It will go up again next winter, too. The supply chain that brings you strawberries from Chile in January is not getting stronger. It is getting more expensive, more concentrated, and more fragile with every passing year. And right outside, in forests and fields and wetland edges all across this country, 20 plants that ask for nothing and never stop producing are doing exactly what they have always done. The only thing that changed is that we stopped looking.